Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku had crashed magic. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The wind that whipped across the rooftop was a liar. It tasted of freedom, of the endless blue expanse that separated the earth from the heavens, a domain belonging to heroes who could leap and fly. But for Izuku Midoriya, it was the taste of a cage door slamming shut. The air, once a symbol of boundless possibility, now felt thin and suffocating in his lungs. It's not bad to dream, kid. But you have to be realistic. The words echoed in the hollow space that had just, moments ago, been filled with a desperate, fluttering hope. They came from the skeletal, almost spectral form of the man who had been All Might, the symbol of peace, his hero. The transformation had been shocking, the story of his injury horrifying, but neither had struck Izuku with the soul-crushing finality of that single, simple piece of advice. Be realistic. Izuku's hands, white-knuckled, gripped the metal railing of the rooftop. He stared down at the city of Mizutafu sprawling below, a vibrant tapestry of life and ambition that suddenly felt muted and gray. Cars were tiny, silent beetles. People were ants. From up here, everything seemed insignificant. He felt insignificant. If you want to help people, the sunken-eyed hero had continued, his voice raspy but not unkind, you could always become a police officer. They get a lot of flack for not being able to handle a lot of the flashier villains, but it's a fine and respectable profession. A police officer. Izuku's mind reeled. It was like telling someone who dreamed of being an astronaut to become a baggage handler. Yes, they were both related to flight, but one soared among the stars while the other was forever grounded. All his life, he had been told he was less. He was a Deku, useless, worthless, a quirkless nobody in a world defined by power. The one person he thought would understand, the one person who smiled in the face of impossible odds and declared that anything was possible, had just looked him in the eye and confirmed it. You are not enough. All Might had left. The door to the roof access stairwell had clanged shut behind him, the sound like a gavel striking down a final verdict. Izuku was alone, with nothing but the lying wind and the shattered fragments of his life's only dream. His bright yellow backpack felt impossibly heavy on his shoulders, weighted down not by textbooks, but by the 14 years of foolish, childish hope he had crammed inside it. His fingers slowly uncurled from the railing. He numbly reached into his bag and pulled out his hero analysis notebook. Number 13. The cover was slightly scorched at the corner from one of Bakugo's casual explosions. He opened it to the fresh, double-page spread he had dedicated to All Might just an hour ago, the ink still smelling faintly of his excitement. The signature, big and bold, sprawled across the page. It was a treasure. Now, it felt like an epitaph. He flipped through the pages. Kamui Woods, Mount Lady, Death Arms. Dozens of heroes, meticulously drawn, their quirks analyzed, their weaknesses theorized, their support gear sketched in the margins. It was his life's work. A testament to his passion. And it was all utterly, completely useless. A collection of fantasy football stats for a boy who would never be allowed to set foot on the field. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and splattered onto the page, smudging the ink of a note about Eraserhead's capture weapon. He slammed the book shut. The sound was sharp and lonely in the quiet of the rooftop. Shoving it back into his bag, he turned and walked towards the door, his steps heavy, each one an effort of will. The descent down the concrete stairs was a journey into a new, dimmer reality. The world outside the stairwell was the same, but Izuku Midoriya was not. He was broken. The walk home was a blur of muted colors and distant sounds. The usual vibrant thrum of the city, the cheerful jingles from storefronts, the chatter of students heading home, the distant roar of a hero's high-speed pursuit, it all sounded like it was coming from behind a thick wall of glass. He saw a young boy drop his All Might action figure and watched as the mother picked it up, dusting it off and placing it back in her son's grateful hands. The sight sent a pang of such profound grief through him that he had to look away, his throat tightening. He was a ghost drifting through a world he no longer belonged to. Every piece of hero merchandise, every news report flickering on a public screen, was a cruel reminder of the door that had been slammed in his face. He was an anomaly, a throwback, a piece of obsolete hardware in a world that had upgraded. He clutched the strap of his backpack, the corner of his notebook digging into his back. Maybe Kakin was right all along. Maybe his mother, with her tearful apologies, knew from the very beginning. Maybe everyone who had ever called him worthless was just being realistic. That was the word, wasn't it? Realistic. A sensible, adult word. It was the word you used to euthanize a dream. He was so lost in his spiraling thoughts that he almost didn't register the familiar sound. A sharp, crackling boom, followed by a series of smaller ones. It was a sound he knew as well as his own name, Bakugo's quirk. Explosions. Normally, that sound would have sent a jolt of excitement through him. A villain attack. A hero fight. His feet would have been moving before his brain had even processed the thought, his notebook already in his hand. But today, his feet remained rooted to the pavement. Why bother? What was the point of taking notes on a battle he could never join? It would only be another exercise in futility, another page in a book of useless knowledge. But then came the screams. The genuine, panicked shouts of civilians. The sirens. The ingrained, obsessive habit of 14 years was a powerful thing. Against his better judgment, his leaden feet began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. He wasn't running with hope. He was a moth drawn to a flame it knew would burn it, propelled by a morbid curiosity to see the heroes he could never be, doing the things he could never do. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. The scene was chaos. A familiar shopping alleyway was blocked off by a growing crowd, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid excitement, all of them holding up their phones to record the disaster. Plumes of thick, black smoke billowed into the sky, and the air was hot and acrid with the smell of burnt sugar and something else, something foul, like an open sewer. Pushing his way through the crowd, ignoring the annoyed shoves and mutters, Izuka finally saw it. And his blood ran cold, the sludge villain. The very same one that had attacked him, that All Might had captured in a soda bottle. It was free, and it was enormous now, a writhing, sentient tsunami of dark green filth, its two manic eyes rolling wildly in its amorphous head. Small fires raged where it had smashed into storefronts, and the heroes on the scene were struggling. Death Arms was trying to land a punch, but his fist just sank uselessly into the villain's fluid body. Kamui Woods was evacuating civilians, his wooden limbs useless against a foe that was not only liquid but also surrounded by fire. Backdraft was doing his best to contain the flames, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. The situation was a perfect storm of bad matchups. They were paralyzed, but that wasn't what made Izuka's breath catch in his throat. It was what was at the center of that disgusting, swirling mass. A spiky crown of ash blonde hair. A school uniform, torn and stained. And a hand, desperately clawing for purchase, palm crackling with futile explosions that only seemed to make the villain larger and more enraged. It was Bakugo. Kakin. The boy who was always so strong, so confident, so overwhelmingly powerful. The boy who walked with the certainty of a future #1 hero. The boy who had told him, with a sneer and a smoking palm, to take a swan dive off the roof just that morning. That same boy was now drowning, suffocating in filth, his body consumed by a monster, and his eyes. Izuka could see his eyes. For the first time in his life, they weren't filled with anger, or pride, or contempt. They were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. They were pleading. For help, for a hero. And no one was moving. The heroes were waiting for someone with the right quirk. The crowd was just watching, filming. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. In that single, horrifying moment, Izuka's despair, his broken dreams, his lifetime of inadequacy, all of it was incinerated by a sudden, white-hot surge of pure, primal instinct. He didn't remember deciding to run. One moment he was frozen behind the police tape. The next the wind was rushing past his ears and the pavement was flying beneath his feet. Shouts erupted from behind him. Hey! Kid! Stop! Get back here, you idiot! His mind was a screaming void. What are you doing? You're quirkless. You'll die. All Might himself said you can't do this. But his legs kept pumping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw Bakugo's terrified eyes, and nothing else mattered. He couldn't just stand there and watch his childhood friend, his rival. He couldn't just watch him die. He fumbled with his backpack, swinging it off his shoulders. His mind, honed by years of analysis, finally caught up to his body, offering a single, desperate, pathetic plan. The eyes. He has a solid form. If I can just hit him in the eyes, maybe it'll distract him. Maybe it'll make him loosen his grip on Kakin. He swung the backpack forward, ready to hurl it. The sludge villain saw him coming. A massive, thick tendril of sludge, larger and faster than the one that had caught him earlier, detached from the main body and whipped towards him. It was a dark green blur of motion, a tidal wave of filth coming to drown him. This was it. The end. His life flashed before his eyes, a montage of doctor's appointments, of his mother's tears, of Bakugo's sneer, of All Might's defeated face. A short, pathetic, useless life. No, the word was not a shout, but a thought, a feeling, a raw, desperate rejection of his fate. He threw his hands up in a useless, instinctive warding gesture, squeezing his eyes shut, bracing for the disgusting, suffocating impact. But it never came. Instead of the wet, heavy slap of sludge, there was a sound. It was a sound unlike any he had ever heard. It was not an explosion. It was not a crash. It was the sound of a universe made of crystal glass shattering all at once, a deafening, crystalline crunch that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. It was followed by a powerful, invisible shockwave that kicked up a storm of dust and debris, forcing him to stumble back a step. His ears rang. The world was momentarily silent. Hesitantly, Izuku lowered his arms and opened his eyes, and the world no longer made sense. The sludge tendril was gone. Not splattered, not deflected, not evaporated. It was simply gone. In its place, the air itself seemed to shimmer, like a heat haze on a summer road, crisscrossed with a million tiny, hairline fractures that were already fading. But that wasn't the most impossible part. The main body of the villain, the massive, swirling vortex of filth, now had a perfect, clean-edged semicircle carved out of its left side, right where the tendril had been connected. It was as if a giant, invisible ice cream scoop had taken a piece out of it. There was no residue, no splashback. Just a void. An absence. The villain itself seemed to freeze, its movements becoming sluggish, its manic eyes wide with something akin to confusion. The sudden loss of mass had compromised its integrity, and its grip on Bakugo loosened. Bakugo fell forward, landing on his hands and knees, coughing and retching, gasping for air in great, heaving sobs. He was free. Izuku stared. He stared at the impossible hole in the villain. He stared at the shimmering, cracking air. And then, he stared at his own two hands. They were just hands. His hands. A little scraped, a little calloused. The same hands he used to write his notes, to make his lunch, to grip the handrails on the train. They trembled violently, not from exertion, but from a deep, profound, soul-shaking terror. What did I just do? The sludge villain let out a gurgling roar of rage and pain. It had lost its hostage and now its full, furious attention was on the small, green-haired boy standing before it. It began to pull its fluid body together, trying to reform, to lash out again. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Izuku. He didn't understand what had happened, but he knew that thing was about to attack again. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a thought in his head beyond a single, primal scream of "Get away from me!" He shoved his hands forward again, a desperate, clumsy pushing motion. Stay back. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. There was no focused semicircle this time. A massive, V-shaped cone of force erupted from his hands. It wasn't an explosion of fire and shrapnel, but an explosion of nothing. The very substance of the sludge villain in that cone was annihilated. Erased from existence. The shockwave that followed was immense, a physical blow of displaced air that ripped through the alley. It tore signs from storefronts, shattered windows, and sent a wave of force backward that knocked Izuku off his feet and threw him skidding across the asphalt. The heroes behind him were thrown back, too, crying out in shock. More than half of the villain was just gone. The remaining portion collapsed into a quivering, barely sentient puddle on the ground, its form too compromised to even hold itself together. silence descended upon the alleyway, broken only by the crackling of the remaining fires and the distant, approaching wail of more sirens. The crowd was utterly, deathly still. No one was filming anymore. Every phone was lowered. Every mouth was agape. And then, a new sound. A booming voice from the sky. I really am pathetic. Izuku, lying on his back, his head spinning, looked up to see All Might, his form now bursting with muscle and confidence, descending from the sky. The hero's face was a grim mask, his eyes not on the villain, but on him. On Izuku. I told you the tenets of being a pro, All Might boomed, his voice echoing with self-recrimination. But I see now I wasn't living up to my own ideals. He landed with a ground-shaking thud between Izuku and the remains of the villain. Pros are always risking their lives. Texas. Smash. All Might threw a single, cataclysmic punch. He didn't hit the villain. He hit the air above it. The wind pressure alone was like a physical god's fury, a miniature hurricane that scoured the alleyway clean. The last vestiges of the sludge villain were splattered against the far wall, and the fires were instantly extinguished. The force was so great, it changed the weather. Dark clouds swirled overhead, and a moment later, a light rain began to fall, pattering softly on the debris-strewn ground. The threat was over. The day was saved, but Izuku felt no relief. He slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, his entire body aching. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, horrifying clarity. He looked at the scene of devastation, the shattered windows, the dented signs, the terrified faces of the pro-heroes who were now slowly, cautiously, picking themselves up, and he looked at Bakugo. Kaken was still on his knees, his breathing ragged. He wasn't looking at All Might, the hero who had technically saved him. He was staring, with wide, unblinking eyes, directly at Izuku. His expression was one Izuku had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't mockery. It was a raw, naked cocktail of disbelief, confusion, and something else, something Izuku had only ever seen directed at Bakugo, never from him. It was fear. The aftermath was a whirlwind of noise and motion that Izuku experienced as if from a great distance. Paramedics rushed in, their boots crunching on broken glass. They put Bakugo on a stretcher, checking his vitals, his eyes never leaving Izuku. Other heroes began cordoning off the area, their movements stiff and wary as they gave Izuku a wide berth. No one cheered for him. No one praised his bravery. He had rushed in, just like in the stories. He had saved the victim. But he wasn't being treated like a hero. Death Arms and Kamui Woods approached him. Their faces were grim. Kid, what were you thinking? Death Arms began, his voice a low growl. You could have been killed. Rushing in like that was reckless and suicidal, and what in the world was that? Kamui Woods added, his voice strained. He gestured vaguely at the path of destruction. Your quirk registration just says quirkless. You lied on a federal document? The property damage alone, you're in a world of trouble, son. Izuku opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. What could he say? I didn't know I had it? It just happened? It sounded like a lie. It sounded insane. He felt a paramedic gently touch his shoulder, and he flinched back so violently he almost fell over. The paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, froze, her hand hovering in the air. He saw the flicker of fear in her expression before she masked it with professionalism. We need to check you for injuries, kid, she said softly, her voice carefully neutral. He let her and her partner check him over, his body rigid and unresponsive. They found scrapes and bruises from being thrown, but nothing major. Throughout the entire examination, he couldn't stop looking at his hands. They felt alien. They felt like weapons. The power that had erupted from them hadn't felt like a part of him. It felt like he had briefly held a shard of oblivion in his palms. It was a power of unmaking. It didn't create, it didn't transform, it didn't control. It just erased. The thought was so terrifying it made him feel nauseous. He had saved Kaken. But to do it, he had unleashed something monstrous. He hadn't punched the villain, or frozen it, or restrained it. He had annihilated it. If his aim had been off, if Bakugo had still been in that V-shaped cone, the thought was a physical blow. He bent over, bow rising in his throat. The scolding from the heroes continued, but the words were just a meaningless buzz in his ears. All he could hear was the echo of that crystalline shattering. All he could feel was the memory of that terrifying emptiness flowing through him. All he could see were Bakugo's frightened eyes. This wasn't the power of a hero. Heroes saved people. Heroes protected. They built, they inspired, they rescued. This power, it only knew how to break things, to break them so completely they could never be put back together again. The rain fell a little harder, cold droplets plastering his green hair to his forehead. He slowly, tremblingly, clenched his hands into fists, trying to contain the terrible potential that now lived inside them. He had spent his entire life dreaming of getting a quirk, believing it was the one thing he needed to become a hero. Now he had one. And he had never felt less like a hero in his entire life. He felt like a monster, hiding in a boy's skin, terrified of the day he might break his cage. The 3 days following the sludge villain incident were a strange, suffocating limbo. The world outside the Midoriya's small apartment buzzed with speculation. News channels ran grainy phone footage of the event on a loop, analysts and quirk experts offering wild theories about the mystery boy with the disintegration quirk. He was a vigilante in training. He was a villain's secret weapon. He was a government experiment. No one, it seemed, considered the possibility that he was just a terrified 14-year-old boy who didn't know what was happening to him. Inside the apartment, the silence was louder than any news report. Izuku spent most of his time in his room, the door closed. He hadn't touched any of his hero merchandise. The smiling face of All Might on his posters felt like a judgment. He moved around his own living space with the cautious, hesitant steps of a man in a minefield. He ate with chopsticks, painstakingly picking up each grain of rice, because the thought of his fingers brushing against the ceramic bowl sent a jolt of ice through his veins. He kept his hands balled into fists or stuffed deep into his pockets, as if they were venomous snakes he was trying to keep caged. His mother, Inko, mirrored his anxiety. She was a ghost in her own home, flitting about with a constant, heartbreakingly fragile smile plastered on her face. She would place his food on the table and retreat quickly. She'd stop trying to hug him, not because she was afraid of him. Izuku knew, with a painful certainty, that she would never be afraid of him, but because she was afraid for him. She had seen the terror in his eyes whenever she got too close, the way he would flinch as if expecting the world around him to shatter. Every interaction was a delicate dance around the terrible new power that sat between them like an unexploded bomb. The call came on the 4th day. It was from the National Quirk Research and Counseling Center. His appearance was mandatory. A power of that magnitude, manifesting so late and so violently, couldn't be ignored. The official, bureaucratic tone on the phone did nothing to soothe the knot of dread in Izuku's stomach. This was it. This was the day they would officially label him. Dangerous. Unstable. A liability. The center was a sterile, imposing building of white concrete and smoked glass, a place that felt more like a futuristic prison than a medical facility. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and disinfectant. Izuku walked with his mother down a long, white corridor, his footsteps echoing unnervously. He kept his gaze fixed on the polished floor, unable to meet the curious, wary glances of the staff they passed. They were led into an observation room separated from a larger chamber by a thick, multi-layered pane of reinforced glass. The chamber on the other side was a stark, gray cube made of some dark, metallic alloy, crisscrossed with glowing yellow lines. It looked like a room designed to contain an apocalypse. A man in a lab coat with kind eyes and a weary expression greeted them. His nameplate read Dr. Kaido Tsubasa. Midoriya-san, Midoriya-kun, he said with a polite bow. Thank you for coming. I'm the head of unclassified quirk analysis here. We just need to run a few simple, non-invasive tests to understand what we're dealing with. The simple tests felt anything but. They took his blood, scanned his brainwaves, and ran a dozen other diagnostics that Izuku didn't understand. Then came the part he was dreading. Dr. Tsubasa's voice came over an intercom, calm and professional, but Izuku could hear the tension humming beneath it. All right, Izuku-kun. We're going to start with a basic activation test. In the center of the chamber, you'll see a 1 kilogram block of carbon steel on a pedestal. All we need you to do is walk up and touch it. Just a light touch with one finger. Do you understand? Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. He nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The heavy door to the chamber hissed open. He took a deep, shaky breath and stepped inside, the door sealing shut behind him with a heavy, final-sounding thump. He was alone in the gray cube. The silence was absolute. He approached the pedestal. The block of steel was smooth and cool, reflecting the sterile lights from the ceiling. It was just a piece of metal. Harmless. But as he looked at it, all he could see was the sludge villain, the impossible void he had carved into its body. Just a touch. He extended his right hand, his fingers trembling so badly he had to steady it with his left. He took another breath, trying to calm the storm in his mind. He focused on the memory of that moment in the alley, the desperation, the fear, the raw instinct. He tried to summon just a tiny fraction of whatever that power was. He didn't want to destroy the block, just affect it. Maybe scratch it. That would be enough. He slowly, agonizingly, lowered his index finger. The air around his hand seemed to grow heavy, charged with a strange, static energy. The moment the tip of his finger made contact with the steel, the world dissolved into silent, white light. The crystalline crunch from the alleyway echoed in his head, but this time it was contained, muffled by the chamber walls. When his vision cleared, he snatched his hand back as if burned. The steel block was gone. The pedestal it had been sitting on was also gone. A perfect, bowl-shaped crater was now scooped out of the reinforced floor beneath it. The edges of the crater were impossibly clean, as if cut by a laser of unimaginable precision. There was no dust, no debris, no shrapnel. The matter had simply ceased to be. In the observation room, Inko let out a choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Tsubasa stared, his professional composure completely shattered, his eyes wide with a mixture of scientific awe and primal fear. The various sensors and monitors behind him were going haywire, needles flickering wildly into the red before shorting out with puffs of smoke. Incredible, the doctor whispered, his voice barely audible. There's no heat signature, no kinetic energy reading, no radiation. It's not a concussive force, nor is it a disintegration beam in the traditional sense. It's like the fundamental laws of physics are just being told to stop applying. They ran no more activation tests. They had all the data they needed, and frankly, they were too afraid to ask for more. An hour later, Izuku and his mother sat in Dr. Tsubasa's office. The doctor sat across from them, a tablet in his hands, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Izuku with an expression of profound gravity. Midoriya-kun, he began, his voice low and serious. Your quirk is, for lack of a better term, an anomaly. A late-blooming emitter type, yes, but its function is on a level we've rarely, if ever, documented. It appears to be a form of high-level matter and energy disassembly. You don't break the bonds between molecules. You seem to be unmaking the very concept of the object you target. He swiped on his tablet, showing them a complex diagram that meant nothing to Izuku. We've tentatively named it. Based on the auditory phenomenon and the visual effect of things seeming to break, we're registering it as Crash. The name landed in the silent room with a heavy thud. Crash. It was so simple, so blunt. It was the perfect name for a power that only knew how to destroy. Dr. Tsubasa leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. His kind eyes were now filled with a deep, sober warning. Izuku-kun. Inko-san. I need you to understand the severity of this. This is not a quirk like super strength or fire breath. You cannot train it by getting stronger. By all metrics, your power is already absolute. Your challenge, your entire life's challenge from this day forward, will be control. Restraint. A single mistake, a moment of lost concentration during a tantrum, a nightmare, the consequences are unthinkable. You didn't just destroy that steel block. The energy calculations, before the sensors fried, suggest that if you hadn't pulled back, you would have crashed a cone-shaped path straight through the chamber, through the building's foundation, and into the bedrock of the city itself. Inko made a small, wounded sound, tears finally overflowing and streaming down her cheeks. She reached out and gripped Izuku's arm, her knuckles white. Izuku felt cold. Colder than he'd ever felt in his life. The doctor's words confirmed his deepest fears. He wasn't just dangerous. He was a walking catastrophe. A natural disaster given a human form. The dream of being a hero, a dream that had already been beaten and broken, now felt like a sick, cruel joke. What kind of hero had a power that could accidentally wipe a city block from existence? The walk home was a somber, silent affair. The official diagnosis hadn't brought clarity. It had only given their terror a name. When they got back to the apartment, Izuku went straight to his room and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He felt hollowed out, a fragile shell around a core of pure destruction. He was Deku. He had always been useless. Now, he was worse than useless. He was a threat. He must have been lying there for hours, lost in a gray fog of despair, when a soft knock came at the front door. He heard his mother's hesitant footsteps, the click of the lock, and then a surprised, muffled gasp. He heard a low, unfamiliar voice, raspy and thin. Curiosity, the first emotion other than fear he'd felt in days, finally managed to stir him. He sat up, listening. "Apologies for the intrusion, Midoriya-san," the voice said. "But I felt I had to speak with your son. My name is Yagi Tashinori. We've met before." Izuku's blood turned to ice. Yagi? That was All Might's name. He scrambled off his bed and crept to his door, cracking it open just enough to see down the short hallway. There, in their tiny janken, stood the skeletal, sunken-eyed form of the man who had crushed his dream on that rooftop. He was holding a simple paper bag that smelled faintly of groceries. His mother was staring, utterly bewildered, at the emaciated man claiming to be an acquaintance of her son. "Please come in," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she bowed. Tashinori entered, giving a weak, apologetic smile. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the apartment and found the crack in Izuku's bedroom door. He met Izuku's gaze directly. There was no pity in his expression, only a quiet, resolute seriousness. "Young Midoriya," he said, his voice just loud enough for Izuku to hear clearly. "Could we speak?" Izuku felt a surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar. What did he want? To tell him to be realistic again? To rub salt in the wound? But he couldn't refuse. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, avoiding his mother's worried, questioning gaze. The three of them sat in the small living room. Inko served tea with shaking hands while Tashinori sat awkwardly on their small sofa, his long limbs looking cramped and out of place. After a moment of heavy silence, he finally spoke. "I imagine you have many questions," he said, looking at Izuku. "About that day." "About me?" He sighed, a tired, rattling sound. "I came to you on that rooftop for a specific reason. I was looking for something. For someone to inherit my power. I was looking for a successor." Izuku and Inko both stared, speechless. "I saw in you a heroic spirit that was truer than any I'd seen in a long time," Tashinori continued, his gaze unwavering. "You were quirkless, terrified, and yet you were the only one who moved to save that young man. But fate, it seems, had another plan for you. You already have a power of your own. A great and terrible one." He paused, letting the words sink in. Izuku's fists clenched in his lap. "It's a villain's power," he mumbled, his voice thick with self-loathing. "It only destroys." "No," Tashinori said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through Izuku's despair with an unexpected intensity. "There is no such thing as a villain's power. Or a hero's power. Do you think my quirk, one for all, couldn't be used to kill? To level cities? The force of my punches could turn a man to paste. A hero with a fire quirk could just as easily be an arsonist. A hero with a healing quirk could prolong a villain's life. A quirk is a tool, young Midoriya. Any tool can build or break. It is the heart of the wielder that decides its purpose." He leaned forward, his sunken eyes burning with a passionate fire that was pure All Might. "The world saw what you did in that alley, and they saw destruction. They saw a dangerous, uncontrolled power. But do you know what I saw? I saw a boy who, upon being told his dream was impossible, still ran headfirst into danger to save someone else. I saw a heart so heroic it forced the power into existence to answer its call. Your body acted before you could even think. Why? Because that is who you are. He sat back, his voice softening. The doctors, the analysts, they are right to warn you. Your path will be harder than any other. You wield a power that demands absolute control, absolute precision. Other potential heroes will train to become stronger, faster, more powerful. You must train for the opposite. You must train to hold back an ocean of power just to produce a single, gentle drop. Your heroism will not be measured in the force of your blows, but in the incredible restraint you show every single second of every single day. That, young Midoriya, is a truer, harder form of strength than any I possess. He looked at Izuku, and for the first time, Izuku saw not a broken man, but the symbol of peace looking through his eyes. You asked me on that rooftop if you could be a hero. My answer was a mistake. It was the answer of a tired, cynical man. Let me answer you again, now that I know who you truly are. Can you be a hero? Yes, you can. If you are willing to carry a burden greater than any other, and never, ever lose sight of that heart of yours. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or tense. It was filled with a fragile, burgeoning thing that Izuku hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. Hope. It was a tiny, flickering candle in a hurricane, but it was there. Tears welled up in his eyes, but these were not tears of fear or despair. He looked down at his trembling hands, and for the first time, he didn't just see weapons. He saw a challenge. A responsibility. He saw the tool that All Might spoke of. It was still terrifying. But it was his. A few days later, Izuku stood at the edge of Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. The place was a monument to neglect, a sprawling junkyard of illegally dumped trash that covered what was once a beautiful shoreline. The salty air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. It was the perfect place to practice. No one would get hurt out here. He had All Might's words echoing in his soul, a new mantra to replace his old despair. A tool. Control. Restraint. He set himself a simple, manageable goal. He found a rusted-out car, its door hanging precariously from a single hinge. His objective: touch the door and use crash to disintegrate only the hinge. A small, precise application of his power. It was the kind of thing he'd have to be able to do to, say, disable a villain's weapon without hurting them. It was a hero's task. He stood before the door for a full 10 minutes, his breathing deep and even, just as All Might had instructed him over the phone. Focus on your heart. Your intent. You are not destroying. You are disabling. You are helping. He reached out his hand, the familiar, terrifying tremor starting up again. He fought it down, focusing his entire being on that single, rusted hinge. He envisioned the power flowing from his core down his arm, but as a tiny, controlled stream, not a raging flood. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer. His fingertip, covered in a worn glove just in case, moved closer. 1 centimeter away. 1 millimeter. The moment it made contact with the cold, flaking paint, he knew he had failed. The power didn't flow. It detonated. The crystalline crunch was deafening in the open air. A colossal shockwave of force erupted from his hand, not just obliterating the car door, but everything behind it. A massive, perfect V-shaped wedge of the junk pile, 50 meters deep and 20 meters wide at its end, simply vanished from existence. Refrigerators, washing machines, tires, tangled masses of metal and plastic, all gone. In their place was a gaping wound in the landscape, ending in a clean, sheer wall of compacted trash. The displaced air rushed back into the vacuum, creating a powerful implosion that kicked up a swirling vortex of sand and debris. The force threw Izuku backward, and he landed hard on his back, the wind knocked out of him. He lay there, gasping for breath, staring at the impossible chasm he had just created. He had tried to produce a single drop. And he had unleashed an ocean. He pushed himself to his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably. The terror was back, colder and sharper than before, because now it was paired with the bitter taste of failure. All Might's words of encouragement felt hollow in the face of this reality. How could he ever control this? How could a person possibly hope to contain something so absolute? He looked at his hand, no longer a tool, but a trigger. The path to heroism didn't feel like a hard road. It felt like an impossible one. His journey wouldn't just be a struggle. It would be a constant, terrifying, moment-to-moment war waged against himself, a war where a single loss would mean unimaginable catastrophe. And as he knelt there, surrounded by the evidence of his own monstrous power, he truly understood. His dream of becoming a hero hadn't been restored. It had been replaced by something far more terrifying, the responsibility to not become a villain. The chasm Izuku had carved into the Dagobah junk pile became his confessional, his training ground, and his starkest reminder. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would stand at its edge and stare into the void he had created. It was a scar on the world, a testament to his failure. And every morning, it was the fuel for his resolve. All Might had seen the result of that first disastrous attempt. He had arrived a few minutes later, reverting to his skeletal form in the shelter of a leaning stack of discarded appliances. He hadn't scolded Izuku. He hadn't shown disappointment. He had simply looked at the massive V-shaped cut, then back at the trembling boy, and nodded slowly. "I see," Toshinori had said, his voice raspy but steady. "The scale is larger than I anticipated. This changes the approach drastically." And so began the most grueling, unorthodox, and mentally taxing 10 months of Izuku Midoriya's life. It was a period that would redefine his understanding of strength, power, and what it truly meant to be a hero. The original plan, as All Might had conceived it for a potential one-for-all successor, was to build a powerful vessel. The cleanup of Dagobah Beach was meant to be a crucible of physical conditioning, forging a body strong enough to contain the explosive power of his quirk. But for Izuku, that plan was obsolete. His problem wasn't a lack of power, it was a catastrophic overabundance of it. His body didn't need to become a stronger vessel. His mind needed to become a more precise valve. "Your quirk, young Midoriya, seems to respond to instinct and intent," Toshinori explained on their second morning at the beach, gesturing at the mountains of trash. "When you were desperate to save young Bakugo, it responded to your desperation with overwhelming force. When you tried to perform a small, precise task yesterday, your underlying fear of the power itself likely caused you to overcompensate. You weren't thinking disable the hinge. You were screaming in your own head, don't destroy everything." Your quirk responded to the magnitude of the scream, not the content of the whisper. The new regimen, therefore, wasn't about lifting heavy things. It was about touching delicate things. The cleanup of Dagobah Beach was still the goal, but the methodology was turned on its head. It became an exercise not in strength, but in supreme, unwavering focus. "Forget about becoming a hero for now," Toshinori had instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "For the next 10 months, your only goal is to achieve absolute mastery over your own hands. You must retrain your every instinct. Your hands are not tools of destruction. They are instruments of precision. You will teach them that." Month 1, the glass bottle. The first month was an exercise in pure torment. All Might would arrive each morning with a crate of empty glass bottles salvaged from a recycling center. Izuku's task was simple, almost laughably so: pick up a bottle, carry it 20 paces to a designated collection area, and set it down without it shattering into a crystalline oblivion. The first day, he went through the entire crate of 24 bottles in less than 5 minutes. Each time his fingers made contact, he would flinch, a microsecond of panic would flash through his mind, and the bottle would simply cease to exist with a faint tink sound, like a single wind chime being struck. There was no explosion, just a puff of displaced air and the phantom sensation of an object that was no longer there. "You are thinking about the quirk," Toshinori coached, observing from a safe distance. "Stop. Do not think about crash. Do not think about not crashing. Think about the bottle. Think about its shape, the coolness of the glass, the texture. Your only intent is to move it from point A to point B." It was like trying not to think of a pink elephant. The more he tried to ignore his power, the more it dominated his thoughts. Days turned into a week. He failed. He failed again. The pile of phantom glass grew. Frustration mounted, a hot, angry thing in his chest. On the 8th day, after his 50th consecutive failure, he let out a guttural scream of rage and slammed his fist into the sand. The sand didn't move. A perfect, fist-sized cylinder of the beach, stretching down further than he could see, vanished. The surrounding sand collapsed into the hole with a soft hiss. Izuku froze, his rage instantly replaced by cold horror. He stared at the hole, then at Tashinori, his eyes wide with apology and fear. Tashinori just sighed, a long, weary sound. I understand the frustration, my boy. But this is the crux of it. You cannot allow your emotions to dictate your power's output. A hero who loses his temper is a menace. For you, a tantrum could be an extinction-level event. Breathe. Center yourself. And try again. The breakthrough came in the third week. Izuku was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. He was on his 300th bottle, or maybe his 400th. He had stopped counting. He was so tired he could barely think. He reached for the bottle, and for the first time, his mind was quiet. It was too worn out to panic. He simply thought, pick it up. His fingers closed around the neck of the bottle. And nothing happened. He blinked. The bottle was solid in his grasp. The glass was cool. He could feel the small, raised letters of the brand name under his thumb. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. He took one step. Then another. The 20 paces to the collection area felt like a mile-long tightrope walk over a canyon. He knelt down, his movements agonizingly slow, and placed the bottle on the sand. He let go. It stood there, intact. A simple, green, empty glass bottle. Tears of pure, unadulterated relief streamed down Izuku's face. He had done it. He had touched something without unmaking it. He looked over at Tashinori, a watery, triumphant grin on his face. The skeletal hero offered a rare, genuine smile in return. It was a bigger victory than lifting 100 tons. The rest of the month was spent perfecting it. By the end, he could juggle 3 bottles at once, his movements becoming fluid and confident. He was beginning to build a new instinct, a subconscious layer of control that kept his quirk dormant during mundane tasks. He was teaching his hands to be just hands again. Months 2 to 4, selective deconstruction. Passive control is one thing, Tashinori announced at the start of the second month, standing before a meticulously constructed pyramid of empty soda cans. Active, precise control is the real challenge. Your new task. Disintegrate one can from that pile without disturbing any of the others. This was a quantum leap in difficulty. It required him to not just suppress his quirk, but to call upon it, to shape it, to aim it with microscopic precision. His first attempt was a miniature repeat of his initial disaster at the beach. He aimed for a can on the bottom row. He focused, channeling his intent, and touched it. The target can vanished, along with the 2 cans next to it, the 3 cans above it, and a dinner-plate-sized chunk of the sandcastle foundation Tashinori had built to hold the pyramid. The rest of the cans clattered to the ground. Too much bleed, Tashinori noted clinically. You are projecting a field, a cone. You need to project a point. A needle, not a nail. The next 3 months were a deep dive into the nature of his own power. Izuku spent hours a day in quiet meditation, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for visceral self-awareness. He tried to feel his quirk, to locate its source within him. He began to sense it as a silent, immense reservoir of potential energy deep in his solar plexus, a sleeping black hole. Activating it was like opening a floodgate. The challenge was to open that gate just a crack. His hero analysis notebooks, once filled with the quirks of others, were now dedicated entirely to his own. He sketched diagrams, hypothesized about the mechanics, and chronicled every success and failure in excruciating detail. Hypothesis 1. The power emanates from my entire body, but is focused through my hands. Maybe gloves could help insulate? Result: failure. The glove disintegrated along with the target. Hypothesis 2. The shattering is a side effect of matter/space being deconstructed. Is it possible to activate the quirk without the sound? A silent crash? Result: inconclusive. The sound seems directly tied to the amount of matter unmade. He started small. He would spend an hour trying to crash a single grain of sand. He would sit for hours with a discarded wristwatch, trying to erase just one tiny gear from its mechanism without touching the casing. His successes were rare and exhausting, leaving him drenched in sweat and mentally foggy, but they were happening. He learned to project a thread of power from the very tip of his index finger. He managed to sever a wire inside a broken television, disabling it without leaving a visible mark on the outside. He was learning to perform surgery with a nuke. The beach cleanup began in earnest during this period. He couldn't just throw things. He had to carefully pick up each piece of rusted metal, each broken appliance, and move it to the collection truck Toshinori had arranged. Every refrigerator was a glass bottle. Every jagged piece of scrap metal was a test of his passive control. The physical labor was grueling, but the mental strain was far worse. By the end of each day, his body ached, but his mind felt like it had run 3 consecutive marathons. Months 5 to 7, the self as a canvas. One sweltering afternoon in July, Izuku was struggling to move a particularly large, waterlogged freezer. He had a good grip, but the angle was awkward. If only I could just disassemble it into smaller pieces, he muttered in frustration. Toshinori, observing from the shade of a makeshift umbrella, overheard him. An interesting thought. But what if you could disassemble something else? Something you have more intimate control over than a freezer? Izuku looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Gildart's Clive, Toshinori said, the name sounding foreign and strange. Izuku blinked, racking his brain. He was a legendary S-class mage from a pre-Quirk era manga series, Fairy Tail, that All Might was surprisingly a huge fan of. His power was crash magic. The fictional basis for your quirk is an interesting study, Toshinori continued. One of his most advanced techniques was not just crashing external objects, but crashing his own body, splitting himself into dozens of smaller, cube-like versions of himself to dodge attacks. Izuku stared at his teacher as if he'd grown a second head. You want me to use my quirk on myself? The thought was horrifying. His power was absolute annihilation. Not to annihilate, Toshinori corrected calmly. To disassemble. And then, crucially, to reassemble. Think of it. If you can master unmaking and remaking your own body, you will achieve a level of control and understanding of this quirk that is beyond anything else. Your body is the one thing you have a perfect, cellular level awareness of. It is the ultimate canvas for you to practice on. But the risk is immense. A single miscalculation, a moment of lost focus while you are in pieces, and you could fail to reform. Permanently. The fear was primal, a cold dread that settled deep in his stomach. But the logic was undeniable. If he could master this, he would truly be the master of his quirk. He started with his left pinky finger. He sat cross-legged in the sand for an entire week, his hand outstretched, just staring at that one finger. He meditated on its form, its structure. Bone, sinew, flesh, nail. He focused his intent not on destroying it, but on separating it. On breaking it down into its core components while maintaining a metaphysical blueprint of its original state. The first time he tried, he felt a sharp, terrifying jolt, like the worst static shock of his life, and nothing happened. But he had felt the power move, infinitesimally. After 2 weeks of relentless, terrifying effort, he succeeded. He focused, and with a soft click like a single piece of Lego coming apart, his pinky finger dissolved. In its place, hovering in the air where his finger had been, were about 20 tiny, perfect cubes of flesh-tone matter. They floated in a loose approximation of his finger's shape, each cube rotating slowly. He stared, breathless. He hadn't just destroyed his finger, he had deconstructed it. He could feel every single cube, as if they were all still connected by invisible threads of his consciousness. Then came the hard part, reassembly. He concentrated, picturing his finger whole and hale. He pulled on those invisible threads, drawing the cubes back together. With another, slightly louder click, they coalesced. His finger was back, perfectly normal, not even a seam to show for what had just happened. A wave of vertigo and nausea washed over him, and he collapsed onto his side, panting. The mental strain was beyond anything he had ever experienced. For the next 3 months, this became his obsession. He moved from his finger to his entire hand. The first time his hand dissolved into hundreds of cubes was a profoundly disorienting experience. He learned to move the cubes independently, to spread them apart, and bring them back together. Then he moved to his forearm. Then his entire arm. Each step was an order of magnitude more difficult and dangerous. To disassemble his arm, he had to maintain the mental blueprint of tens of thousands of unique components, from bone marrow to nerve endings, and reassemble them in the correct order. A mistake could mean permanent nerve damage, a malformed bone, or worse. The concentration required was so immense that he could only practice for an hour a day before collapsing from mental exhaustion. But it was working. This terrifying, intimate practice was forging a bond between him and his quirk. He was no longer just wielding it, he was becoming one with it. He learned its nuances, its feel. He could now sense the difference between the intent to disassemble and the intent to annihilate. The former felt like carefully unscrewing a complex machine. The latter felt like dropping it into a star. Months 8 to 10, the heart of the wielder. The final 3 months were about integration. The beach was nearly clean. Izuku's physical body was lean and strong from the constant labor, but the real transformation was internal. His demeanor had changed. The frantic, nervous energy of the old Izuku was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet calm. His movements were deliberate and mindful. He was a boy who was constantly aware of the cataclysm he held in check. All Might's mentorship shifted from quirk specifics to the philosophy of heroism. They would sit on the now clean sand, watching the sunset, and Toshinori would speak. He didn't tell war stories of his grand battles. He told Izuku about the people he'd failed to save. He talked about the weight of his title as the symbol of peace, the pressure to always be smiling, even when he was terrified or grieving. True strength, my boy, isn't the power to win any fight, Toshinori said one evening, his voice soft against the sound of the waves. It's the wisdom to know which fights are worth fighting. It's the courage to walk away. It's the restraint to use just enough power to solve the problem, and not announce more. Any brute can level a building to stop a purse snatcher. A hero finds a way to stop the thief, save the victim, and leave the building standing. For you, that principle is not a guideline. It is a sacred vow. Izuku absorbed these lessons like a sponge. His hero analysis notebooks began to change again. He still analyzed heroes and their quirks, but his focus shifted. He was less interested in their ultimate moves and more in their methods of capture and restraint. He filled pages with theories on non-lethal takedowns, on using his power for rescue rather than combat. Could I crash the locks on a bank vault to free hostages without bringing the building down? Could I disassemble a collapsing bridge and hold the pieces in stasis long enough for people to get off? Could I use a focused crash to perform emergency surgery, removing a tumor or a piece of shrapnel without cutting the patient open? The possibilities, once terrifyingly destructive, were becoming hopeful. His quirk was still a hammer, a devastatingly powerful one. But All Might was teaching him that a hammer wasn't only for demolition. It could also be used to build, to protect, to forge. On the final day of the 10th month, the day before the UA entrance exam, Izuku stood on the pristine sands of Dagoba Beach. The last truckload of junk had been hauled away that morning. The shoreline was beautiful, the water clear and blue, the morning sun glinting off its surface. Toshinori stood beside him, looking out at the reclaimed horizon. He looked proud. You did it, young Midoriya, he said quietly. You moved a mountain. Both literally and figuratively. Izuku looked down at his own hands. They were calloused and scarred from 10 months of hard labor, but they were steady. For the first time, they felt like they were truly his own. He raised his left hand, and with a quiet confidence that would have been unimaginable 10 months ago, he disassembled it into a cloud of hundreds of tiny, shimmering cubes. He made them dance in the morning light, swirling like a flock of birds, before pulling them back together with a soft click. There was no strain. No nausea. Just control. He hadn't gotten stronger. He hadn't increased his power output by a single watt. But he had achieved something far more important. He had faced the monster inside himself, stared into its annihilating gaze, and had not blinked. He had learned its name, its nature, and had taught it a new word, enough. Tomorrow, he would walk into the UA entrance exam. He wouldn't be the quirkless boy hoping for a miracle. He wouldn't be the terrified boy with a catastrophic power. He would be Izuku Midoriya, a boy who carried an apocalypse in his hands and had spent 10 months learning how to offer a handshake instead. He was ready. The air in the UA High Auditorium vibrated with nervous energy. It was a palpable force, a chaotic symphony of 1,000 teenage heartbeats, each one drumming a frantic rhythm of hope and anxiety. Izuku sat amongst them, a small, green island of calm in a churning sea of bravado and jitters. 10 months ago, he would have been vibrating more intensely than anyone, his muttering analysis and starstruck awe a source of irritation to those around him. Now, he sat perfectly still, his hands resting calmly in his lap, his breathing slow and measured. His focus was entirely internal, a quiet hum of readiness that drowned out the external noise. Present mixed boisterous, ear-splitting presentation on the exam's rules barely registered. Izuku had already read the pamphlet cover to cover a dozen times. He absorbed the information not with the frantic energy of a cramming student, but with the cool, detached focus of a strategist reviewing a battlefield map. 3 types of robots: 1-pointer, 2-pointer, 3-pointer. A 10-minute time limit in a sprawling urban replica. Points awarded for disabling them. It was a straightforward combat test designed to evaluate power, speed, and offensive capability. And for 99% of the applicants, that was the correct interpretation. Bust in, break as much as you can, and rack up the points. For Izuku, this approach was an absolute non-starter. His mind, honed by months of relentless self-analysis, saw a completely different exam. The robots weren't targets, they were puzzles. The city wasn't an arena, it was a liability. The other students weren't just competitors, they were potential collateral damage. The real test for him wasn't about what he could destroy. It was about what he could choose not to, and be sure to avoid the gigantic 0-pointer. Present Mike shrieked, a massive silhouette of a truly colossal robot flashing on the screen behind him. It's worth no points, so it's just an obstacle. Think of it like a thwomp from Super Mario. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. Izuku's eyes narrowed slightly, filing the information away. An obstacle. A disaster-level threat designed to test risk assessment and evasion. Good to know. A sharp, officious voice cut through the din. A tall, well-built boy with dark blue hair and glasses stood up, his arm chopping the air with rigid precision. "Excuse me, sir. I have a question. On the printout, there are clearly 4 types of villains listed. If this is an error on official UA material, it is a shameful disgrace." "And you," the boy suddenly swiveled, his arm now pointing directly at Izuku. "You with the curly green hair. You have been muttering and fidgeting this entire time. If you are not going to take this seriously, then you should leave. You are distracting those of us who are committed to becoming heroes." The spotlight, both literal and metaphorical, swung onto Izuku. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare. The old Izuku would have imploded, stammering apologies and turning a shade of red that would rival a fire truck. The new Izuku simply blinked. He hadn't even realized he'd been muttering, a deeply ingrained habit resurfacing under pressure. He met the serious boy's gaze, offered a small, polite bow of his head, and fell silent. His calm, almost unnervingly placid response seemed to throw the accuser off more than any panicked denial would have. Present Mike quickly clarified that the 4th robot was the 0-pointer, smoothed things over, and sent them on their way. As Izuku filed out with the rest of the examinees heading for Battle Center B, he felt a familiar, aggressive presence shove past him. "Out of my way, Deku." The voice was a low growl, laced with the usual contempt, but there was a new, brittle edge to it. Izuku looked up to see Katsuki Bakugo striding past, not even bothering to give him a second glance. The 10 months had been as transformative for Bakugo's perception of Izuku as they had been for Izuku himself. The fear Izuku had seen in his eyes after the sludge villain incident had long since curdled into a resentful, confused fury. Izuku was no longer just a pebble in his path. He was an incomprehensible anomaly, a living paradox that Bakugo's black and white worldview of strength and weakness couldn't process. He had a powerful quirk now, but he was still Deku. It didn't make sense. And Bakugo hated things that didn't make sense. Izuku watched him go, a flicker of old anxiety stirring before he gently pushed them down. Bakugo was just another variable. Another factor to be managed. The gates to Battle Center B were colossal, a testament to the scale of what lay within. The city replica was breathtaking, a maze of concrete, steel, and glass that stretched as far as the eye could see. The other applicants were buzzing, stretching, showing off their quirks. A boy with engines in his calves, the same one from the auditorium, did a few warm-up sprints. A girl with pink skin and strange, horned antennae bounced on the balls of her feet. A boy with a bird head stood stoically, his arms crossed. Izuku did none of this. He simply stood near the back of the crowd, his eyes closed, his breathing even. He wasn't psyching himself up for a fight. He was extending his senses, building a mental framework for his own power. He visualized the reservoir of crash within him, calm and placid. He pictured the valves and conduits of control he had spent months building in his own mind, checking them for leaks, ensuring they were sound. He was a technician performing a pre-flight check on a doomsday device. And begin! Present Mick's voice boomed from unseen speakers, so loud it made the ground vibrate. The effect was instantaneous. The massive gates slid open, and the entire crowd of examinees surged forward like a tidal wave, a cacophony of quirks activating. Explosions, laser beams, shouts, and the grinding of metal echoed through the artificial streets. Izuku was left standing in the dust, seemingly frozen at the starting line. What are you waiting for, listener? Present Mick's voice seemed to be aimed directly at him. There's no countdown in a real fight. Go! 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 Izuku opened his eyes. He hadn't been frozen. He had been waiting. Waiting for the initial chaotic stampede to pass, for the other applicants to spread out. Plunging into that maelstrom would have been reckless. His quirk, even with his newfound control, was too dangerous in a crowd. He took a single, centering breath and then broke into a steady, ground-eating run, his footsteps silent and deliberate as he entered the city. He rounded the first corner, and came face to face with a one-pointer. It was a sleek, green machine on a single tread, its red optical sensor locking onto him instantly. It raised a small cannon from its chassis. The old Izuku's plan would have been to run. The average applicant's plan would be to punch it until it broke. Izuku's mind, a supercomputer of heroic analysis, processed the threat in a nanosecond. Target, one-pointer. Objective, disable. Method, structural decomposition of primary locomotion system. Power output required, 0.01% of total capacity. Projected collateral damage, 0. He didn't slow down. As the robot fired a harmless pellet gun, he ducked under the projectile and continued his forward momentum. He didn't rear back for a punch. Instead, he simply reached out his right hand, his fingers relaxed, and as he ran past, he let his open palm gently slap against the robot's single, central tread. There was no boom. No shattering shockwave. Just a soft, dry crack, like a stone hitting a frozen pond. The entire tread assembly, from the rubber belt to the internal gears and pistons, instantly dissolved into a shower of fine, gray dust. The robot's body, its momentum carrying it forward, tilted and crashed face first into the asphalt with a pathetic screech of scraping metal. Its optical sensor flickered and died. Disabled. 1 point. Izuku didn't even look back. He was already running, his eyes scanning the rooftops, the alleyways, his mind processing the city layout, the sounds of distant combat, the probable locations of the next targets. He came upon a trio of 2 pointers cornering another applicant, a girl with brown, bobbed hair and a cheerful round face. She was touching them, causing them to float helplessly in the air, but she was clearly struggling to manage all three. A little help? She squeaked, her cheeks flushed with exertion. Targets, 3 2-pointers. Objective, disable. Ally present. Avoid direct contact with her quirk. Method, precise severance of internal power conduits. Power output, 0.03%. Let them drop, Izuku said, his voice calm and even. The girl looked at him, surprised but nodded. She pressed the tips of her fingers together, and the 3 robots fell from the sky. They crashed to the ground with a tremendous clang, their anti-gravity systems disabled. Before they could reorient their targeting systems, Izuku was moving. He didn't touch the robots themselves. He slammed his left hand flat against the pavement in the center of the trio. He unleashed not a cone, but a focused, underground shockwave of his crash quirk, a razor-thin disk of energy that spread out beneath the asphalt. Crack! 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 The 3 robots, which had just started to push themselves up, simultaneously slumped back to the ground, inert. Their optical sensors went dark. From the outside, they looked completely undamaged, but inside, a surgical line of deconstruction had passed through their chassis, severing their primary power cables as cleanly as a scalpel. "Whoa," the girl breathed, staring at the silent machines and then at Izuku. "How did you do that? What's your quirk?" "It's complicated," Izuku replied, already turning to run. "You should keep moving." "Good luck." He left her standing there, bewildered. He couldn't afford to stop. 10 minutes was a painfully short amount of time. He moved through the city like a ghost. He was a study in lethal efficiency, repurposed for nonviolence. He saw a massive three-pointer, a brute of a machine resembling a scorpion, bearing down on a group of students. They pelted it with a barrage of elemental attacks, fire, ice, electricity, that seemed to have no effect on its thick armor. Izuku ran along the side of a building, using his encyclopedic knowledge of physics from his notebooks. He leaped from a fire escape, not towards the robot's main body, but towards its raised tail. Mid-air, he reached out and touched the very tip of its cannon-like stinger. A soft tink. The stinger, the cannon, and a 2-meter section of the tail vanished. The robot's center of balance was thrown completely off. It stumbled, its attack ruined, and crashed into the side of a building, its legs flailing uselessly as it tried to right itself. Disabled. 3 points. He landed in a roll, already seeking his next target. His point count was rising steadily. 1, 3, 4, 6, 9, 11, 14. He wasn't causing massive, flashy explosions like Bakugo, whose signature booms he could hear echoing from a few blocks over. He wasn't leveling his opponents with overwhelming physical force. He was a deconstructionist, a surgeon. He moved with a quiet, deadly grace, his every action calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum collateral damage. He crashed the ankle joints of running robots, causing them to topple. He touched the barrels of their cannons, rendering them inert. He tapped their optical sensors, blinding them. Each action was accompanied by that soft, distinctive crack, a sound that was beginning to unnerve the few other applicants who witnessed it. They saw robots simply falling apart at his touch, with no visible cause or effect. To them, he looked less like a hero in training and more like a grim reaper for machines. He even began to use his self-disassembly, a technique he had practiced to the point of instinct. A 2-pointer ambushed him from an alleyway, swinging a massive pincer. Izuku didn't have time to dodge. In a split second, his entire torso dissolved into a cloud of hundreds of green and white cubes. The pincer swung through the empty space where his body had been. The cubes flowed around the robotic arm like a flock of birds, reforming instantly behind the robot. Before the machine could even process what had happened, Izuku placed his hand on the back of its power core. Crack! The robot slumped. Izuku took a deep breath, the adrenaline of the maneuver making his heart pound. The self-disassembly still took a toll, a momentary wave of disorientation that he had to fight through. It was a high-risk, high-reward defensive move, one he knew he couldn't spam. He glanced at the timer on a public display. 4 minutes remaining. His point count was solid, probably enough to pass. But he had no rescue points. He hadn't actively saved anyone, only assisted or prevented potential harm. In the eyes of the judges, he was just an efficient robot killer. He needed to prove he was more than that. He needed to prove he was a hero. It was at that moment that the ground began to tremble. A low, grinding roar echoed through the concrete canyons, a sound so deep it vibrated in his bones. The other applicants stopped fighting. The chaotic sounds of battle died down, replaced by a growing, collective gasp of disbelief. From behind a towering skyscraper at the center of the exam site, a shadow fell over everything. Izuku looked up, and kept looking up. A colossal figure was rising, its immense form dwarfing the 20-story buildings it was surrounded by. The 0-pointer. Present mixed description had not done it justice. It was a mechanical titan, a god of the scrap heap. Its body was a dark green behemoth of armor plating and hydraulics, its single, glowing red eye the size of a city bus. Each step it took was a miniature earthquake, cracking the pavement and shaking buildings to their foundations. The reaction of the other examinees was immediate and universal, pure, unadulterated panic. It's the 0-pointer. Run! It's impossible to beat. Forget the points. I don't want to die. A stampede began, a mad scramble away from the approaching titan. The same students who had charged into battle with cocky grins were now fleeing for their lives, their bravado shattered. Izuku felt the instinct to run, too. It was the logical, sensible choice. The machine was an obstacle. Engaging it was pointless and suicidal. He began to turn, to join the retreating crowd, and then he heard it. A small, pained cry. Ow! He whipped his head around. There, not 20 yards from the zero-pointer's path, was the cheerful, brown-haired girl from earlier. She was trapped, her leg pinned beneath a large chunk of debris that had been shaken loose from a building by the robot's tremors. She was struggling desperately, but the concrete slab was too heavy. Her face was pale with pain and terror as she looked up at the mechanical god bearing down on her. Something inside Izuku's chest went very still. He saw her terrified eyes. He saw the other students running away, not even noticing her plight. He heard All Might's voice in his head, a memory from a quiet evening on the beach. A hero is someone who puts the safety of others before their own. They are the ones who run towards the disaster when everyone else is running away. In that instant, the exam, the points, the passing grade, all of it became utterly meaningless. There was only one thing that mattered: the girl was in danger. His legs were moving before his mind had finished processing the thought. He sprinted not away from the zero-pointer, but directly towards it, his path closing the distance to the trapped girl. "Hey!" she shouted, her eyes wide with panic as she saw him approaching. "What are you doing? Get out of here! Save yourself!" He didn't answer. He was already analyzing, his brain working faster than it ever had before. Problem: imminent threat from zero-pointer. Victim trapped. Objective: rescue. Option 1: free victim. Debris is too large. Crashing it risks harming her with the shockwave or collapsing debris. Time: insufficient. Option 2: stop the threat. The zero-pointer is too massive. A simple touch won't work. Attacking a leg might unbalance it, but its fall would be uncontrolled, potentially crushing the entire block, including the victim. Time: insufficient. There was no way to punch it. He wasn't All Might. He couldn't meet overwhelming force with even greater force. He had to be smarter. He had to use his power in a way no one would ever expect. He had to unmake not the robot, but its very foundation. He reached the girl, skidding to a halt beside her. He gave her a look of such intense, unwavering calm that it momentarily stunned her into silence. "Don't worry," he said, his voice steady. "I've got this." He turned to face the approaching Titan. It was so close now he could see the individual rivets in its armor plating. Its massive, building-sized fist was raised, preparing to smash down on the very spot where they were. He had seconds. He dropped into a low crouch, planting both of his palms flat against the cracked asphalt of the street. He closed his eyes, shutting out the terrifying sight of the descending fist, and focused his entire being downward. He wasn't targeting the robot. He was targeting the city itself. He took all the control, all the precision, all the restraint he had cultivated over 10 agonizing months, and he let it go. He unleashed his quirk not as a point, or a line, or a cone, but as a wave. A massive, hemispherical wave of deconstruction that plunged deep into the earth. Crash! The sound was not the soft crack or tink of his earlier efforts. This was the sound of reality breaking. It was a deep, resonant, soul-shaking crunch that was felt more than it was heard, a grinding tectonic groan that ripped through the entire battle center. The street in a 100-meter radius around Izuku didn't explode. It didn't crack or shatter. It deconstructed. The asphalt, the concrete, the soil, the sewer pipes, the bedrock beneath, it all resolved into a roiling, collapsing sea of cubic matter. He had turned the very ground the zero-pointer stood on into a bottomless pit of shifting, unstable blocks. The zero-pointer's colossal foot, which had been planted firmly to support its crushing blow, suddenly had nothing to stand on. With a deafening shriek of protesting metal, the Titan lost its footing. Its immense weight became its undoing. It tilted not forward but backward, its raised fist swinging wildly through the air where Izuku and the girl had been moments before. It crashed down harmlessly a block away. The robot's entire body followed, toppling over like a felled redwood tree, away from the trapped girl, and slammed into a row of empty buildings with a cataclysmic impact that shook the entire district. The effort was staggering. A wave of pure, debilitating exhaustion slammed into Izuku. His vision swam with black spots. The sheer mental and physical cost of unleashing that much power, even for a split second, was astronomical. His arms trembled violently, and he collapsed onto the shifting, unstable ground he had created, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The dust began to settle. The terrible grinding sound subsided. In the sudden, ringing silence, the girl stared. She looked at the toppled titan, its red eye flickering and dying. She looked at the impossible, shifting crater that had saved her life. And she looked at the small, green-haired boy who had collapsed after performing a miracle, a boy who had faced down an impossible threat not by destroying it, but by unmaking the world beneath its feet. From a darkened observation room high above the city, a group of figures watched the screens in stunned silence. Did he just take out the zero-pointer? A voice, belonging to a pro-hero with long, black hair and tired eyes, asked in disbelief. He didn't take it out, a small, bear-like creature in a suit replied, his hands clasped behind his back. He merely changed its tactical circumstances. But the result is the same. On another screen, a new score began to flash, unseen by any of the applicants below. Examinee 7111, Izuku Midoriya. Villain points, 45. And next to it, another number began to rapidly climb. Rescue points, 60. The final buzzer sounded, its shrill cry echoing through the now silent city. The exam was over. Izuku lay on the ground, his consciousness fading, the last thing he saw being the round, worried face of the girl he had just saved, looking down at him with awe and gratitude. He had done it. He had been a hero. The week between the entrance exam and the arrival of the acceptance letters was a unique form of torture. For Izuku, it wasn't the anxiety of the unknown that plagued him, but the certainty of what he had done. He replayed the final moments of the exam in his mind 1,000 times, the deafening crunch of the ground deconstructing, the shriek of the toppling zero-pointer, the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of letting go, of unleashing a wave of power so immense it had felt like a part of his soul was tearing away. He had passed out from the strain, waking up in a pristine white recovery room with recovery girl tuteing over him. The exhaustion had been bone deep, a mental and spiritual fatigue that lingered for days. He had saved the girl, he'd learned her name was Ochako Uraraka, and she had visited him, her face a mixture of boundless gratitude and profound awe. But he had done it by unleashing the very catastrophe he had spent 10 months learning to contain. He had won the battle, but in his own mind, the war for control felt far from over. Had he been a hero, or just a successful demolitionist? When the letter from UA finally arrived, his hands were perfectly steady as he opened it. Inside was a small, metallic disc. It projected a hologram of All Might, in his full, heroic glory. "I am here, as a projection," the hero boomed. He went on to explain the scoring system, showing clips of other students' impressive feats. Then, the screen changed to show Izuku. It showed his surgical takedowns of the smaller robots, earning him a respectable 45 villain points. An impressive score. Enough to pass on its own, All Might declared. But that is not all. A hero course judges more than just a person's ability to smash villains. The screen then showed the final moments of the exam from multiple angles. It showed Uraraka trapped. It showed the other students fleeing. And it showed Izuku, a lone green blur, sprinting towards the danger. "You acted without hesitation." All Might's voice swelled with pride. "Putting your own safety, and indeed your own chances of passing the exam, aside to save another, such actions are the very heart of heroism. And so, they are rewarded." The screen flashed. Izuku Midoriya, 60 rescue points. With a combined total of 105 points, you have passed the exam, young Midoriya, finishing in first place. Welcome. Your Hero Academia starts now. The hologram flickered out, leaving a stunned silence in the room. Inko was weeping with joy, hugging her son tightly. Izuku felt a slow, warm feeling spread through his chest. It wasn't just his power that had gotten him in. It was his heart. The judges, and All Might, had seen past the terrifying method and recognized the heroic intent. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that the two could coexist. That his destructive power and his desire to save weren't mutually exclusive forces at war within him, but two sides of the same heroic coin. The first day at UA was surreal. Finding his way to the colossal door of Class 1A, he was filled with a sense of nervous excitement that was both new and familiar. It was the dream he'd had his entire life, finally made real. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next chapter, and slid the door open. The scene inside was chaotic. The rigid blue-haired boy from the exam, Tenya Ida, he would soon learn, was arguing with Bakugo, who was sitting with his feet propped up on his desk, an arrogant sneer fixed on his face. The moment Izuku stepped inside, several heads turned. He was recognized instantly. Whispers broke out. "Hey, it's him! The guy who took out the zero-pointer. Seriously? He doesn't look that tough. I heard he didn't even touch it. Just waved his hand and the ground ate it." Izuku felt a blush creep up his neck at the attention. He was saved from having to respond by a cheerful voice. "Oh, it's you!" The plain-looking boy. He turned to see Ochako Uraraka, her round face breaking into a wide, happy smile. "I'm so glad we're in the same class. Thank you so much for what you did at the exam. It was incredible. I went to the principal afterward and asked if I could give you some of my points, but they said it wasn't necessary. You had more than enough." Her bright, bubbly energy was infectious and disarming. Before Izuku could stammer out a reply, a new voice, low and profoundly tired, cut through the chatter from the doorway. "If you're here to make friends, you can leave now." Everyone froze. Lying on the floor in a yellow sleeping bag, looking like a disheveled caterpillar, was a man with long, black hair and tired, bloodshot eyes. He took a long slurp from a juice pouch before slowly unzipping himself and standing up. "It took you all 8 seconds to quiet down. Life is short. You're all too slow on the uptake." He scanned the room, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Izuku. "I'm your homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa. Now, put these on and meet me on the field." He tossed a set of blue UA gym uniforms onto his desk. The locker room buzzed with confusion and speculation. A quirk assessment on the first day? What about the entrance ceremony? The orientation? This was not what any of them had expected. Izuku changed quietly, his mind already racing. Aizawa. Pro hero, Eraserhead. His quirk, Erasure, allowed him to nullify the quirks of others just by looking at them. Izuku had pages on him in his notebook. He was an underground hero who valued logic, efficiency, and rationality above all else. Flashy, destructive powers would not impress him. In fact, they would likely earn his ire. This was a test of potential, not just raw power. On the field, Aizawa's tired drawl laid out the stakes. "You've all been taking standardized physical exams since junior high. But you were never allowed to use your quirks. That's irrational. The country still insists on treating us all as equals when our powers make us fundamentally different. Today, you'll be retaking those tests, but this time, you're free to use your quirks however you see fit. Whoever comes in last place will be judged to have no potential, and will be expelled immediately." A wave of panic swept through the class. "Expelled? On the first day," Bakugo, Aizawa said, his voice flat. "You got the highest score on the practical exam for villain points. What was your farthest softball throw in junior high?" 67 meters, Bakugo growled. "Try it with your quirk." Bakugo stepped into the circle, a wicked grin spreading across his face. He wound up, and as he threw the ball, he ignited a massive explosion in his palm. "Die!" he screamed, the word echoing across the field. The ball rocketed into the sky, leaving a smoke trail. Aizawa held up a small device. 705.2 meters. Know your own maximum. It's the most rational way to form the foundation of a hero. The class erupted in excited murmurs. 705 meters. This looked fun. They could use their powers to their fullest. Izuku felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was the worst possible kind of test for him. It was a series of challenges that seemed tailor-made to encourage reckless, overwhelming displays of power. For him, a reckless display could level the school. Aizawa's gaze fell on him. The teacher's eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to see right through him. He held up a data pad, his thumb hovering over Izuku's name. Izuku Midoriya. Your file is interesting. A late blooming quirk registered as Crash. described as a high-level matter disassembly power, responsible for the single most destructive and expensive act in entrance exam history. His voice was devoid of praise. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the cold weight of a final judgment. "Show me," Aizawa said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that seemed to cut through the surrounding chatter. "Show me that you're not just a liability. Show me you're not just a natural disaster waiting for a bad day. Show me you have control." The unspoken threat was clear. It wasn't just about coming in last place. For Izuku, this was a pass/fail test on his very right to be here. One mistake, one flashy, uncontrolled display of power, and he would be deemed too dangerous for UA. He would be expelled not for a lack of potential, but for having far too much of the wrong kind. The first test was the 50-meter dash. Tenya Ida, with his engine quirk, posted an incredible 3.04 seconds. A frog-like girl named Tsuyu Azui used her long tongue to propel herself. Bakugo used small, controlled explosions to fly across the distance. When it was Izuku's turn, he stood at the starting line, his mind racing. He couldn't just touch the ground and propel himself. The force would be too great. He needed something more controlled, more focused. He remembered his training with All Might, the endless hours of trying to project a needle, not a nail. The starting pistol fired. Izuku took a single step, and then, instead of pushing off the ground, he cupped his hands behind him. He focused, opening the valve of his power just a sliver. With two soft, distinct cracks, he crashed two small, grapefruit-sized pockets of air directly behind him. The resulting implosion of the surrounding air rushing into the vacuum created a powerful, albeit clumsy, thrust. It wasn't graceful. He stumbled and nearly fell, but it propelled him forward in two distinct bursts. He crossed the line in 5.58 seconds. Not great, but not last. More importantly, he hadn't destroyed the track. Aizawa watched, his expression unreadable, but he made a small note on his datapad. Next came the grip strength test. Izuku watched as a large, muscular student with multiple arms recorded a score of 540 kilograms. He knew, with absolute certainty, that if he tried to use his quirk, even a fraction of a percent, the delicate measuring device would cease to exist. This was a different kind of test. A test of wisdom, knowing when not to use your power. He took the device, gave it a firm but normal squeeze, and handed it back. The reading was 56 kilograms. A perfectly average, slightly below par score. A few students snickered. Izuku ignored them. He saw Aizawa's eyebrow raise, just a fraction. Another note was made, the standing long jump. He cleared the sandbox by using the same air-crashing technique, a little more refined this time. The side-to-side steps were a trial of agility, which he managed with his own unenhanced physique. Through it all, he was a portrait of quiet competence, never excelling, but never failing. He was placing squarely in the middle of the pack, his scores unremarkable. He could feel Bakugo's furious glare boring into the back of his head. The explosive teen couldn't understand it. Why was Deku holding back? After the stunt he pulled at the exam, why was he suddenly acting so weak? Then came the final, most crucial test, the ball throw. This was the main event. This was the showcase. Uraraka had already gone, touching the ball and scoring an infinity by making it weightless. Everyone was expecting something spectacular from the boy who had defeated the zero-pointer, Midoriya. "You're up," Aizawa said, his voice flat. He tossed Izuku a softball. Izuku caught it. The smooth leather felt alien in his palm. He walked to the circle, the eyes of his classmates on him. He could feel their anticipation. He could feel Bakugo's simmering rage. He could feel Aizawa's heavy, judgmental gaze. He knew what they expected. A massive explosion of force. A reality-breaking shockwave that would send the ball into orbit. He could do that. It would be easy. All he had to do was touch the ball and let go, just a little. But that wasn't control. That was just a bigger hammer. All Might's words echoed in his mind. Your heroism will be measured in the incredible restraint you show. He took a deep breath, quieting the storm of expectations around him. He focused not on the ball, but on the air. On the physics of propulsion. He wasn't going to crash the ball. He wasn't going to crash the air in front of it. He was going to create a perfectly contained, directed force behind it. A microscopic, surgical strike on reality itself. He wound up his arm, his movements mimicking a standard baseball pitch. His motions were fluid, practiced from watching countless games on TV. As his arm came forward, reaching the apex of its arc, he focused his quirk into the tiniest possible point at the tip of his middle finger. At the precise, split-second moment he released the ball, he allowed an infinitesimal thread of his power to lash out. He didn't touch the ball with his quirk. He touched the space directly behind it. There was no sound. No shockwave. No flash of light. For a moment, it looked as if nothing had happened. The ball left his hand and seemed to just hang in the air for a fraction of a second. Then, the universe seemed to notice the tiny, localized vacuum he had created and corrected the imbalance with extreme prejudice. The air rushing in to fill that pinprick of nothingness created a contained, perfect jet of force. The ball didn't explode, it was launched. It shot forward with the force of a railgun, a white blur that broke the sound barrier with a sharp crack that made everyone jump. It ascended at an impossible angle, climbing higher and higher until it was a tiny speck, and then vanished completely into the deep blue of the sky. Silence. The entire class stared, their jaws agape. Bakugo's eyes were wide with disbelief. Uraraka and Ida looked on in pure astonishment. They had expected a spectacle of destruction. They had witnessed an act of impossible precision. Aizawa stared at the sky for a long moment before slowly lowering his gaze to the device in his hand. He turned it around for the class to see. The screen displayed a single, sideways figure 8, infinity, infinity. The class exploded into a fresh wave of murmurs, this time laced with genuine awe and a hint of fear. He got infinity too, but how? There was no sound, no explosion, it just went. What even is his quirk? Aizawa's face was a stony mask, but Izuku could see something in his tired eyes. It wasn't approval, not yet. It was a flicker of shock, a grudging acknowledgement that what he had just witnessed was not the act of a reckless powerhouse, but of a mind in supreme control of a terrifying force. He had been expecting a nuke, and Izuku had delivered a scalpel. After the final tests were tallied, Izuku placed a respectable 10th. He hadn't come in first, but more importantly, he hadn't come in last. The student who had, a short, purple-haired boy named Minoru Mineta, was weeping in despair. By the way, Aizawa said, his voice dripping with bored nonchalance. The whole expulsion thing was a rational deception. To make you push yourselves to your limits. The class erupted in outrage and relief. Izuku just let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As the students began to file back towards the locker rooms, Aizawa's voice cut through the air. Midoriya. Stay behind. Izuku's blood ran cold. The other students shot him sympathetic or curious glances as they left, leaving him alone on the vast field with his teacher. Aizawa walked slowly towards him, his black costume and capture weapon making him look like a grim specter in the afternoon sun. He stopped a few feet in front of Izuku, his gaze intense. I've reviewed your file. I've read the analysis from the Quirk Center. Words like absolute, unlimited, and catastrophic are thrown around. They're not exaggerating, are they? Izuku swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. No, sir. They're not. Aizawa was silent for a long moment, simply studying him. The other students in this class have so much room to grow, he said, his voice low. Bakugo needs to learn control. Uraraka needs to overcome the drawbacks of her quirk. Ida needs to learn to think outside the box. Their potential is like a ladder they have to climb. But you, he took a step closer, his eyes boring into Izuku's. Your ladder is already at the top. Your potential isn't about growth. It's about containment. Your power is already limitless. Your challenge is to live your entire life within those limits. He gestured vaguely at the sky, where the softball had disappeared. That throw, that was the most terrifying display of power I have ever seen. Not because of its strength, but because of its precision. To wield a power that can erase a city block and use it to propel a baseball requires a level of focus and control that is, frankly, monstrous. Izuku flinched at the word. Monstrous. Don't mistake my meaning, kid, Aizawa continued, his voice softening just a fraction. I'm not calling you a monster. I'm telling you the scale of the burden you carry. The other students here might worry about accidentally hurting a civilian. You have to worry about accidentally deleting them from existence. A single mistake for you, a single moment where your anger or your fear gets the better of you, and the consequences are not just failure. They're an atrocity. He let the words hang in the air, their weight settling on Izuku's shoulders like a physical thing. I will be watching you closer than any other student. I will push you harder. I will hold you to a standard that would seem cruel and unfair to anyone else. Because it has to be. If you are to become a hero, you cannot afford a single misstep. Your burden is greater than anyone else's here, problem child. Aizawa turned to walk away, his capture weapon swishing softly. He stopped at the edge of the field and looked back. Don't ever forget that. The words were not a threat. They were a warning, a confirmation, and a challenge. As Izuku stood alone on the field, the setting sun casting a long shadow behind him, he finally understood. UA wasn't just a place to learn how to be a hero. For him, it was the only place in the world where he could learn how not to be a villain, and his homeroom teacher, the tired, cynical man who had just laid the weight of the world on his shoulders, might be the only person who truly understood the difference.